Well, thank you for this invitation, and I was telling Alicia, it seemed like years ago that we started planning this, and then all of a sudden here it is. So again, thanks for the invitation, and I hope that you will get some good advice today, and also be able to have some things that will be implemented in your programs pretty quick. So I'd just like to say that as president of both the Oral History Association and the Southwest Oral History Association, one of our commitments is to local community projects. And while the national organization is very much more affiliated with institutions and faculty, the Southwest Oral History Association and the regional organizations are much better geared toward community-based work. So we have two very different audiences in both organizations, but from the beginning, the Oral History Association, which is almost 50 years old now, has sponsored many things with the local and regional associations, which has been really great for communities to have people coming in from outside. And so, so I do this quite a bit for community groups, and hopefully you will get busy on your projects immediately after leaving here. So I'd like to start by saying that oral historians, I mean, one of the problems with oral history is that everybody feels they can do it. Everybody is conversing with other people. Everybody can sort of have a little recorder, and that what they do in the process of interviewing is just a conversation. Well, it is just a conversation, and one of the reasons that I picked the front portion, if you see the little drawing there, you need to learn how to become an interviewer and a listener for your narrator. And so I always say, this much is the interviewer and this much is the narrator. And you have to learn that practice. We're also bound by ethical considerations developed by the Oral History Association. So I'm not going to read a lot of these things. I just wanted you to have something that you could go back to when you're considering projects or when you're actually debating the kinds of things that you want to do. One of the things with Native communities is the difference between oral tradition, storytelling, and oral history. And it always surprises me that even Native communities have a hard time distinguishing between the three. So the definition that I've sort of developed has been that oral tradition is really passed down from family member to family member in very concrete and very systematic ways. And it's also always passed down in very specific language, dealing with very specific stories, whether it's family related or community related or spiritual guidance. They're always passed down in pretty much the same format, same words from generation to generation. Storytelling, on the other hand, is more life experience. So the stories expand and contract depending on what the community needs at that moment or what the family needs at that moment. So Little Red Riding Hood, for example, tells us not to talk to strangers. But we can add other different kinds of elements into that story if we want. So that storytelling is important because it does affect certain generations in certain ways that maybe their parents didn't hear the story in the same way. Oral history is a way of looking at prisms of perspective. And I like to think about it in terms of a kaleidoscope. So as you change a kaleidoscope, the colors change, the shapes change. And there is no one correct oral history. It's only a prism of perspective. So to challenge people and say, well, that's not the right way to do it, or the wrong way to do it, or that's the wrong way to do it, isn't really helpful to the process. I think the best thing that we can do is to recognize that that is that person's perspective, and that's what you need to go with. So it may be faulty, it may not remember everything, it may not be complete, but it is their story. And that story is just as important as any other document. So for a long time, and still in many cases, oral history is seen from an academic perspective as not a very good method, a research method. That is slowly dying away as we're seeing that most social history that's done in the 20th, has been done in the 20th century, has included a lot of oral history with it. So that is falling away a bit, but it's still very difficult for students going through the process because of institutional review boards that want to see your questions, that want to evaluate what you're doing. And primarily that's geared toward, for the most part, IRBs, or institutional research committees or boards, are tied to some sort of medical human subjects practice. In oral history, we do a very different type of looking at lives. And in this case, in the oral history case, we're not expecting people to tell us everything. It's not an open book. The story that they tell us is very uniquely tied to their experience and what they want to tell us. So the Oral History Association has been battling with the concept of instructional review committees for a long time now, and we're finally making some inroads in that because we don't require the information. People can just say that I prefer not to talk about that, and ethically we're bound to just drop whatever. In a human subjects experiment or project, that's not the case. That you're either participating fully or you're not participating. So there's a big difference between the way that oral history is done for the social sciences and even within the social sciences. So for example, in oral history with historians, we're about collecting the story and giving it a name and a face. When social scientists do it, they're looking at anonymous, sort of quantitative, how many people felt this way. And they also are bound to destroy or return their information. With oral historians, we're looking at it from the perspective of this is belonging to history. These stories belong to our story collectively. So see how there are lots of different perceptions and kind of complement each other, sometimes work against each other. So just be aware that when you're doing a project, there are different ways that people will see it. So you need to be very, very explicit in how you develop your program, in what your early thinking is, and in how people can use your work in the future. If you're doing a family history, you certainly want to collect it so that generations down the road will have this history. If you're doing it on an individual, and here we're going to talk about artists, you want to do it to, again, perpetuate their legacy, or even just have them reflect. As artists, they're reflective practitioners to begin with. Their art develops and they move through eras of their work. They move through various media in their work. And so what we're trying to do is, with artists, is to develop a sense of what that life was like. And it's their particular story. So that's where we are with that. Always, however, we're bound by ethical practices. And this gives you an introduction to the Oral History Association guidelines. We have a much longer guideline set on the website that you're welcome to look at, and I have given you the information to go back to that website and take a look. But what I'd like to do is to sort of take you through the process of doing the interview. And I'm not going to melt, but it just looks like that. And really think about how we're doing the interview. So, to begin with, we are dealing with developing a project. And we will talk more about this, but you have to give significant care to how you develop your project. Oral histories are very labor intensive and they're very resource intensive. So in both cases, you have to really be committed to what you're going to do and to set realistic expectations for yourself. So when I go into a community and they want to do 50 oral histories in a year, I just kind of have to go, well, maybe we should rethink this. And more often than not, what happens when I'm called into a community is that the project is off track. I mean, it's way off the track. The volunteers no longer want anything to do with the project. There are no resources left. No one's talking to each other. And so I'm supposed to come in and fix this in one evening session. And usually I can do that. I can actually do that. And what it takes is, and what often has happened is people have come into these projects, everybody thinks they're on the same page, they have their initial meetings, they do their planning, and everybody goes away with 10 different projects. 10 individuals, 10 different projects. They've never talked about the project as an entity. They've only kept their project in their own mind. So the first thing I do is have a project meeting. And I generally like to work with the smallest group possible. Who are the leaders in this project? And what I do is get them to be very clear with me and with each other about what they anticipated with the project. So once they hear that they all had different ideas, they begin to understand that, yes, they were looking at 5 or 10 different projects, and so that's why it didn't happen the way that they thought it should, because everybody was then the project director. So we start to get everybody on the same page. We begin to look at, what was important about the project, what kinds of people were included, what was their, what themes were they covering, and we pretty much take it as a very basic research project, which most academics, most students are used to doing. So it's actually teaching people how to do this kind of research that is the key point to this. So we start with a pre-interview. We start with a project design. We say, this is our goal. I'll give you a good example. Right now I'm working with the East Mountains Oral History Project in Albuquerque's East Mountains, which is a very diverse community that can range from 100-year or more old ranches, Hispanic ranch families, all the way down to people who are in biker communities, in artistic communities. They're off the grid. And so this is a really wide range of folks to deal with in a community project. So what we did was they invited me to come and talk to the group, talk to the planning group. And we sat down and we actually laid out what it is that you're trying to get at. Who are the various communities that you're trying to address in this project, and how do you be fair to each of those entities? And from that emerged a list of about 40 people, either because of age or because of occupation or because of how they came to the community. They were also interested in, it's relatively old, but also relatively new. So how do we bring those two groups together in terms of the history of the community? So we developed a list of people. We looked at equipment. We looked at how many people would be available to interview. We just took it step by step. And that took 2 meetings for us to come to some consensus on. Then it was developing the forms. What kind of releases are we looking for? How is this material going to be used? Who is going to have access to the material? Are you connected with a repository that will help you and assist you with developing policies and procedures so that you're not collecting these oral histories out here and then you go to deposit them somewhere and they say, oh, well, you didn't do X, Y, and Z. The earliest that you can begin to talk with, the earlier that you can begin to talk with a library, a repository, an academic library, a cultural center, whoever you think would be open to receiving the collection, the better you are for that. Not only in terms of developing the policies and procedures around which you will donate the material, but also in many cases the repository is very happy to help you either with duplication or with help with transcription or some sort of help that they'll provide in exchange. So the sooner that you talk with that organization, the better. But really the key here is the development of policies and procedures. how are you going to make these available past the collection part? So we've got all of this kind of thing, and we're going to go back to that in a little bit. But those are all the kinds of thinkings that you want to do before you begin to plan your interview. So let's say with the East Mountains Project, we had 40 people. They decided that what they really wanted to focus on as their first stage of the project, and they're going to continue this as years go by. But the first year, what they wanted to do was to concentrate on the eldest members of the community, because they were the ones with the community memory. And in terms of Hispanic folklore, music, just people who had come to the community 50 years ago, and how did they integrate into that community. So it was important for them to get this sense of what that community is and was, and where it is going. So they developed a list of 40 names. We picked out 15 names that they would do the first oral history interviews with, and they have completed them. And one of the things was, we did all of the planning. We knew exactly how many people were going to be available for interviewing. We knew exactly how many interviewers we had. We had the right equipment within the community itself. There were businesses that were willing to help coordinate things. So, for example, there's one of the women in the community is a small business owner, has a computer store, and she fixes computers, and she helps people program and helps people with whatever problems they're having. But she became then the place where everything was deposited in the beginning. So you would go and get the equipment from her. She would have it checked out. She would check it out to you, but she would also have prepped it for you. So you made an appointment to pick this equipment up. She would have the equipment for your use. She would have a backup copy, or backup equipment. And then when you finished your interview, you would bring it back to her. She would put it into the computer system and maintain it in a safe place. And then she would check everything and make the equipment ready for the next person. So they came up with these really interesting systems that the community could participate in. Not everybody can be an interviewer, and not everybody should be an interviewer, and not everybody is going to be a narrator. So once we had that kind of thing settled, people would say, oh, well, I can do the library research, or I can do the newspaper reading, or I can take a look at photographs. And so they began to really work together as a team, and everybody took the part that they were best at. And that left a really good project in place. Now, I learned a long time ago that if I become the person who takes that project and I'm the key person, it becomes my project. And I don't want that to happen. So the more that I got involved, the more people backed away and said, oh, well, Rose is going to be there to do it. So now, pretty much, I just focus on those types of community projects in the training. So I go in, I do the oral history training, I do the project development, help them with that, so that it is vested with them and it is their project. Because I can't take it forward, only the community can take it forward. And so I really stress that. And they may have me talk to local businesses or somebody that they invite into the meeting, and we generally can, grab them to do something. But I'm not going to be that person who's going to step in and take over that. Those basic sorts of community needs, and it really is. Then it becomes a community project. So let's go to what is on your booklet, page 4, and I have a really big manual that I use for full day workshops, but for these smaller workshops and discussion focus groups, I tend to just pull things out that you would find particularly useful. So in the pre-interview, we're going to talk about your research, what it is you hope to do, and I generally start to say, well, as a researcher, what do I do? Well, as an historian, what I try to do is to say, what type of historian am I? And that's the kind of question that you should be asking the consultants or the professional people in your group. For me, that question is answered by saying, one, I look for stories that have been mediated. So perhaps there's a story there, but it hasn't really made itself onto the traditional or mainstream history. So that's a mediated story. If there is, the other way is a silent story, if the story just doesn't exist at all. And then my job is to advocate for inclusion of those stories. So, so that's the kind of historian I want to be. And I think it's pretty effective because then people know that you care about the project, that you are going to be their advocate. You are going to help them with the decisions that they need to make toward a project. So, there are 3 different ways of doing interviewing, and this is part of that design process that you're thinking about, but it's also can be included as part of the process of the interview. The first way that you do an interview is a discovery interview, and that's very basic, very informal, generally. It's a part of the process of getting to know the person that you're interviewing. If you're not familiar with them, if you don't know if they're in good health, or you know, their name has come to you, but you don't know very much about them. So it's really a rapport building activity as a discovery interview. It can also lead you to other people. Who else should I talk with? And it begins to draw people into that project as you're talking things over with them. The second type of interview is event-related, and that has become more and more common as we've engaged in things like the Library of Congress Veterans Project or the Folklife Center, Braceros program, for example. So they're very specifically related to an era of time or to an event. And those have become really widespread with the catastrophes that people have gone through. Katrina, the hurricanes, any kind of the tsunami, all of these have, in fact, created a new genre of oral history doing. And it is interesting to me that it's not just the community that was affected by it, but also the first responders that the oral histories are being taken from. So there are also lots of repositories that are being developed just to handle these types of things. Columbia University with 9/11, several institutions in the Louisiana area who are depositing materials with them about Katrina. And throughout that area, other projects have come aboard because people moved from one location to another, and what does that story tell us? So event-related is the second type. And then the third type is life cycle. And that includes everything from what you remember about your grandparents or your early life, clear down to, you know, what advice would you give to young people today? So it's a full story. And let me tell you how these break down. The discovery interview is pretty quick, and what you're trying to do is to establish a way into that interview. It's either something that you want to do or something that you find out can't be done with this particular person, but you're also trying to get information. And I always tell projects that the first person that they need to look for is the community historian, the person who has been collecting photographs, collecting newspaper articles. There's always somebody in a community, several people, who have various interests. If you find those people, then discovery interviews with them become very invaluable, and it cuts down your research by about 50%, because you have documents, you have somebody who knows the story, and are very willing to share that with you because they've been collecting it, just waiting for you to come and ask them for it. So, so that's that process. With event-related stories, you want to do about 10% of their life before the event. 60% then would be the total, or the story that you want from them about the event, and another 10% what has happened since then. When you do a life cycle, you do 10, 80, 10. And then you do 20, 60, 20. So that's about the percentage of time that you want to spend on that activity. In the pre-interview that we started to talk about, it's really the preparation phase. How are you preparing? How are you going to go about asking questions? So for me, I don't really like to provide the specific questions to a person. What I like to do is to get some topical or general interest questions so that I can provide it to them without having the spontaneity in the interview taken away from that. So what you find that happens if you give people the direct questions, then it just becomes a yes or no, or they only focus on that. Where if you ask an open-ended question, they may give you 2 or 3 different examples of that same story at different parts of their life. So in terms of the question developing, lots of people do create their question, give it to the interviewer, give it to the narrator, and work from there. I prefer not to do that because I think it takes away some of the spontaneity. So I prefer to work through a general, topical, okay, we're going to talk about your childhood, young adulthood, work life, married life, retirement. So they're big kind of sections of their life that they can talk about. I used to go in without really preparing the narrator at all, just sort of a spontaneous interview. And what I found out is that with older folks, what happens is they get very anxious about what they didn't tell you, what they thought about after you left. So this has kind of calmed that down and has served me well to be able to send them something and say, oh, well, think about these things and jot down some notes, or is there a particular story that you want to tell around this? So that has been invaluable. And just something that I pass on that will generally work. Who are going to be the narrators? Who are going to be the interviewers? What other role will people have in the project? Not everybody should be an interviewer. And this is really hard for communities to understand until they see what happens when everybody becomes an interviewer. Then there's nobody left to do any other jobs. So, and often the people who want to be the interviewers are not the people who are good listeners. They're the people who are good talkers. And that's not what you want in doing an interview. As I said before, you're looking to do looking to do a lot of listening, very little talking. So, for example, in a 1-hour interview, I can do that with 6 questions. I don't have to have a full list because the person lends themselves then to a conversation, and especially if they have notes of what they want to talk about. There are plenty of jobs for people to do in a project. You just have to find the right job for the right person, and limit the interviewers, because interviewers get better as they practice. And so, then they'll be able to train other folks. But for the first couple of years, I would say hang on to the same interviewers if you can. And then things start to gel, and they can train people. So we're looking at partnerships, not only in the group, but we're also talking about partnerships with your narrators. And how do you get them vested in the project? So all of these are things that you need to discuss and prepare for in the pre-interview. The better prepared you are going in, the better oral history you're going to get. So let's move into the interview a little bit, and we will be taking a break, and then in a little bit, as soon as we get through this part, and then we'll do some other, I'd like to do some interactive things before we end today. So what you want to do with your narrator is to set the stage. Get them to draw a picture. Think of their life as a canvas, and how are they going to draw themselves on that canvas. For me, interviews are like Christmas presents. And say you have a big box, and you shake it, and kind of sounds interesting, but you can't really guess what's in there. And then you open it, and there's another box, and there's another box, until you get down to the very small box, which has, you know, big diamond in it or something. I've never gotten that, but I'm hoping one day. But that's how I see an interview, is this peeling away, this engagement in sort of gift giving. Because that's what a story is. An individual's life story is their gift to you. And you have to be really respectful of that. And I work with a lot of students who want to go into oral history, and then they discover that it's a conversation, and they get really nervous because they're used to texting, and that doesn't work in a conversation, at least with an older person. So, and I'll tell you, the two hardest groups to train to interview are students and attorneys, because everything to attorneys is a deposition. So they want the facts, and they don't want the extended story. They just want, you know, to know very specific things. So those are the two hardest groups for me when I'm talking about training for the interview. So you're getting ready to do your interview. What kinds of things are you asking about? Are you looking at topics? Are you looking at the individual as a life story? All of those things are part of your discussion from the beginning. So the interview itself is the specialness of what's going on. That is really the gift to you. And everything up to that point has been the preparation. That is really the gift in terms of the interview that you will sort of build your foundation for the project on. So once you finish with the interview, there are things that you need to be aware of, to take charge of afterwards. And that is to really be thankful to the person that gave you the interview, either through a thank you card or a gift or some little thing. It's really important to know what the protocols are within each community. For example, my husband works with a Japanese community in doing oral history, and it's very important in the beginning to take a gift and to acknowledge them for their participation in this. And not doing that is sort of disrespectful. So part of the job of the community historian that you're finding will be that they can help you determine what those protocols are. Men and women sometimes within societies are different. How you approach them, how you talk with them, just the words that you use. All of these are very important to getting a good interview. Men and women, they go through the interview quite differently. With men, they tend to focus on big events in their lives. So work, military life, anything that has been sort of out of the ordinary. With women, they're much more comfortable talking about the very ordinary, children and family, work, that kind of thing. I would caution about interviewing a husband and wife together, because the husband never knows the real story. And the wife lets him know that every chance that she gets. So they're either doing a lot of this or kicking under the table, or she's looking at him as if, you know, he's speaking Klingon or something. So you just want to stay away from those. And if possible, interview the person alone without the wife in the house, because what you hear is a lot of activity in the kitchen with cabinets slamming and doors slamming and things, so that the husband knows he's not telling the right story. And it's very intimidating. It's very intimidating to the husband. So if at all possible, hopefully you and the other person are the only people in the room. However, that doesn't work with a lot of cultures, to have a young man and an elderly woman. So knowing the protocol of how that works is important. And I had a young man once ask me, well, you know, I've been trying to interview this elderly Hispanic woman, and she hardly lets me in her door. And I thought, well, are you talking with her family? Did you set up a meeting with her family so that they know what you're doing? No, I didn't do that. Well, do you think that it might be a good idea to have somebody in her family there with her, so it's not, you know, a young man in the house with an elderly woman? And he said, you know, that never occurred to me. So I think just those common kinds of courtesies are very invaluable in the interview. And among those are being very thankful for the person giving you the interview, and that you're just not going to walk away from it. You are going to give the person the opportunity to review the transcript, to listen to the tape, to help you in the editing process, because you're not going to get everything right. You're not going to get all the spellings, you're not going to get the dates, so you want to invest them in the process as much as possible and keep the door open to either another interview or to assisting you in that editing process. And then, if you can, if you're working with a repository, to have some sort of public event that they can participate in. And that's always, you know, people always say, well, I don't really have anything to tell. I don't, you know, you approach somebody and you know that they've had kind of an interesting life, you don't know all the details, but their name keeps coming up. And so, you know, there's something there, but they will tell you, I don't really have anything to say. And once you provide them with some sort of topical page, they begin to think in terms of, oh, yeah, well, you know, yeah, my husband died during the flu epidemic, and we were the funeral directors, and I had 9 kids, and so when he passed away, I had to take over the funeral business. Well, that's a story, raising 9 children, and here you are, never having had to do this business end of things, and now here you are with, you're still the owner, and you're, you know, 89 years old. So those stories are always going to be invaluable. The other thing about, and I should have mentioned this prior to this, but in your pre-interview stage, see what other interviews have been done with people in that community. Because what happens oftentimes is the same people keep getting interviewed. And what occurs because of that is that they begin to frame a story in only one direction. And that story is going to be the same in the interview they did in 1940 and the one they did in 1970. The only thing that will have changed will be the dates. But pretty much they will tell the same story. And what you want is to maybe listen to the story if it's available. Take a look at it, see how you can update it. First of all, if that's an important person in the community, how can you update it? What hasn't been asked? And then to move forward with that. Don't worry so much about the early part. Worry then about what is later said. But the more that people get interviewed, the more that they have a story set in their mind. And there's been lots of studies done on memory and how memory is carried. And they've been doing work with veterans, for example. And the memory that veterans carry is often very specific, either to a specific event or to their military service. And so I kind of equate it with, they have a treasure chest sort of in their mind, and they lock that story in there, and that's how they're going to tell it. It's not going to be different from time to time. They're going to tell this particular story. So your job then as the interviewer is to try to get a few more details, a little bit more information. So that memory is really key to your interview. How do people remember things? What do they remember? Is it the same story over time? One of the things that I really would like to see, especially with artists or any creative person, is a series of interviews over time. So if you get them at 25, what are they doing here? What are they doing at 40? What are they doing? And even don't even wait that long, every 5 years or so, to sort of see where they've changed before they're 90 years old and trying to think back. So I would really like to see more of that kind of interviewing be more important to projects. But then you have to sort of sustain that project over time. So again, that's another reason for getting involved with a repository that's going to be there, first of all, in the next 5 years and can help you with that kind of collecting. So if you go to your page 28, I know we've gone through a lot of pages now. So I'm trying to give you just kind of a very quick overview of what the interview looks like and the project. But where I really want to spend the time is on developing the project. So The project is really, whether you're doing an individual or whether you're doing a group of people or a community, the questions are who, what, when, where, and how. That's what you want to answer. And people, when you say that to them, they think, oh, well, that's so broad. But if you think in terms of what is the question that you're trying to answer? What is the historical question that you're trying to answer? So for the East Mountains, it would be, what has life been like in the last 100 years for you? And you're making it very specific to that person. You're not making it sort of just a general question, but you know a few things about this person, and then how do you personalize that question around them? So project goals have to be realistic, or else people lose interest. You begin to see your volunteers falling away. You have to be able to check things off so people feel like the project is moving along. Even if it's just meetings. We met, we discussed this, okay, that's off, you know, check that off. We're moving ahead. The reason for working with a small group in terms of planning is it's much easier to keep control of it. So if you have maybe, I like sort of 5 to 7 people as project directors, in a way directors, but more the project team, so that you can actually answer different questions without having to go out to a committee. And then they sort of become the interpreters for everybody else that's working on the project. Budget should really be a key thing that you discuss. For every hour of interview that you do, if you're going to get transcriptions done, it's about $32 to $35 an hour for transcription services. If you get somebody who is a transcriber and can do that pretty quickly, they can transfer an hour worth of tape into a transcript in 3 to 4 hours. If you rely on volunteers or rely on people who aren't used to using the transcription process, then it will take you as much as 12 to 15 hours. So you have to be really smart about where you're going to put your resources. I used to think, well, I have to transcribe everything because that's my responsibility. But what I found out was it's much easier and I'm more ready to do the final edit on something than if I've heard it 10 times and I'm trying to swim in it. So transcribing and transcription services, I've moved in that direction. While it may be a little bit more expensive in the beginning, it really does save a lot of time over the course of the project. So budget, always think about that. For volunteers, we never seem to think of what resources they're using. So can you make gas cards available? Can you do something that will help the person do the interview? Pay for their time. They're usually volunteers. So what can you do that will make the person feel like they're valued in the project? So let's talk about a little bit about project boundaries. Sometimes projects start out very, very big, and you're going to look at, you know, for the East Mountains project, they wanted to look at the last 100 years, going along with the centennial theme. So we sort of kicked that around, and what we came to was we need to talk to people who have lived in the East Mountains for the majority of their lives during these last 100 years. Well, that we came down to a very small group of folks that were in that age group. So that kind of pared down what we were doing. But we also wanted to look at the types of people. Are we, you know, how many ranchers are we going to do in this 15? How many business people? How many craftsmen? You know, so we wanted a variety of people that could represent the community over that time period. What time frames are we looking at? So if we have 5 people that are 99 years old, and we have nobody in this, in this other end, so we actually had to work to try to space out some people who were 90, some who were in their 80s, going down to about, I think about 75 was the youngest person. But it gave us a range of ages, and it gave us a range of experiences to go with. Geographic boundaries. The East Mountains are bound by about, I think there were 32 neighborhoods in the East Mountains. Who knew? I was just stunned that, you know, they actually do have neighborhood associations represented, and there were 32 in that whole area. So they were actually able to draw money for from the county. There's a county-city project that will help you to do history projects. They found that out by going to the neighborhood associations and working with the person in Bernalillo County who handles that. So they were able to leverage the amount of money that they got in a small grant against what they would be doing with the neighborhood association. So there are ways, you're going to find different things that you never knew existed by going out and searching through things. So we talked about the budget. We've talked about setting realistic expectations, which means that you set project deadlines. And it's a way of gauging what people can do, can't do. Are we moving through something too fast? Are we getting a quality product? So you're, in a way, always evaluating what you're doing, and that's good. It's good to be evaluating because you can streamline your project then. You can move from something that's very loose to something that's very streamlined, and you're getting the job done in less time and reaching your goals at the same time. A master timetable, you know, the East Mountains group, and I'm just using them because I've just finished working with them and we're in the process of a public program now. They knew that they were going to interview 15 people. They got 14 done. The 15th one is going to be done right after their event, but they were able to get photographs and a small biography of the gentleman, and then they're going to do his interview right after that, right after their big public event. So they developed a master timeline. We're going to get so many interviews done in this amount of time. And if we're not done, then everything is going to stop and we're going to concentrate on that. And that's what they did. So by the time they reached their, probably their 10th interview, they were just rolling right along, and they knew the jobs that had to be done. And by having that master plan, it helped them to look ahead, but also to be able to say, okay, this is done, this is done, this is done, and we can move forward. So, methods. Again, just to reiterate, there are tasks for everyone in the project, and you know, you need to determine who can be in the project long term, who can be in the project short term. What specialists or consultants do you need to bring in? For this East Mountains project, they wrote me into the project early on. So they asked me, how many hours do you think X, Y, and Z would take? So we figured out, I think, something like 6 hours in the total project, but it was up to them to determine when they used me. So I wasn't going to go in and do 6 hours on one day and then be gone. I told them I would rather participate in, if we do an hour and a half here, an hour and a half there, and use me when you need me. Use me as we're moving through the project so that we can really define and have that set up there for the group. So that's what we did. We split up the time, so I did, I think, 4 sessions with them over the last year. Some of it was training, some of it was just coming in and listening to what they were doing, advising them on what directions, refereeing sometimes. This part of the group wanted to do this part of the group wanted to do that. So I would get invited or get a quick phone call to say, how do we deal with this, or what's your opinion? And it's much easier to use me that way as a consultant because then I become the referee. And they can go back and say, well, Rose said this is the way we should do it. And it's nobody's fault in the group. It's my fault, or it's on me. And that's a really effective way to deal with that. So I've talked about a public program with this. They're having an event at their church, their local church, in June. They're inviting the 15 living treasures, as they're calling them, to the event. They've got certificates. They're inviting their families, and you know, kind of kicking off this East Mountain Oral History Project. And everybody's still enthusiastic about it. And I think that that planning has a lot to do with it. They knew what to expect. They knew to evaluate and get rid of what didn't work, add what would work, and you know, and move along through that. So, and they had this idea of a public program from the very beginning. So they were working to get the church, and they had people who were doing that. So that was their job. So they weren't involved in any other part, but they were in charge of the program, developing the programs, inviting the people, doing all of that stuff. So you also need to think in terms of how to involve your public. I talked a little bit about the businesswoman who was offering her services to kind of hold everything in her computer, not database, her server. That was her contribution. She said, I wish I could give you $1,000. I can't, but I can give you $1,000 worth of services. And that would, if that would help you out. So they went to various businessmen and in the community, and that's what they got. They got donations of, food for when the committee met, donations of equipment. There was actually a businessman who I think purchased 6 small digital camera recorders for them. So there are ways of getting the community involved in, and how do you keep them involved? Well, you provide information, you identify the community scholars, there's fundraising, there's volunteers for different things. So don't use everybody to do the same thing at once. Kind of spread it out, spread the joy out among a lot of people. So for the long term, how are you going to protect these materials? How are you going to make sure that the material that has been provided to you by an individual gets protected? And by protection, I mean, when you go to do an interview, people always want to share important papers, photographs, that kind of ephemera that comes with doing this kind of project. And what we did in the East Mountains was to go, the repository is going to be their library, but the Chamber of Commerce actually gave them a room to work out of. And it's a secure building. There is a security system. They're keeping all of the stuff there until they can transfer it as a project to the library. They also had an agreement with the UNM Center for Southwest Research to accept the materials. So they're looking at how to make this material accessible to the community, so it just doesn't stay within their community, but becomes part of the state story and then part of the national narrative, which I think is really key. I think when we think in terms of community projects, we don't often think of how does our community tie into the history of the country. And so we haven't really begun that process yet. So when I talk to groups, I really put an emphasis on that there is a national story that you're part of, whether you're a war veteran or whether you're a community-based person, you're part of the state history, which then it becomes part of the national narrative. And those are all important stories that need to be included. The last thing, but not the last thing in the project, but something that you should consider, is how you're going to evaluate, assess, and change things. Who's going to be responsible for that? And how is that going to happen? I think that sometimes when I talked about people coming in to the project and then it falls apart because everybody thinks they want to do it their way, this evaluation process gives everybody a chance to say, this works and this doesn't work. This worked for me. I don't know how to run the equipment. Can we do something about that? So if you're doing it as on a consistent basis through the project, then you can say, okay, this is working, this isn't working, and we're going to do this as project protocol from now on. So always think in terms of evaluation. And then finally, did we forget anything or anyone? Who are we not including? And is there something that we don't know about the community that we need to, that we found out? How do we incorporate that into the project? So there's a lot to think about in terms of developing even an individual project, which most of you may be doing with artists, but these are all concepts that you need to have in mind when you are working to develop that project. And I've just added a couple more things for you. The oral history biographical sketch on the next page is a good way to do the discovery interview. This is a way to sit down, even if you don't use that person, you have some information on which you can go back and talk with them. But this helps you to see, you know, how, I don't want to say coherent, but you know, especially with older folks, do they have good memories? Are they remembering things? And this is the biographical sheet. We'll give you a sort of small picture of their life in total, and then you can, you know, determine as a group whether or not that's the kind of person or the type of person that you want. And it may be that it's not for this time around, it's going to be for the next time around. And then finally, in terms of the protocols, the release and donation agreements, which is the last page. And I only include this because most projects will require this, even if you're doing an individual project, but you at some time hope to give that to someone, a repository of some kind. So this can happen in several ways. One, this is the direct deed of gift release form. And what this does is, I'm sorry, what was your name? Yeah, Donna is doing a project on her husband. So they may not be ready to pick a repository, but what you may want to do is to say in the future, you know, who has the right to pick. So it may be one of your children that, you know, or an estate or something where they will take the responsibility for giving that off to a repository. Some of the things that we've been having problems with, and we added, I think in the second paragraph here, there is so much media and mediums available that what we were finding is some of the early oral histories that have been done were never cleared to be used on the web. And so we either had to go back or we had to limit the use of those kinds of interviews. So if you're going to if you think that you want to put it up on the web, you should include that, because part of doing this process is that your narrator that they be well informed about what's going to happen to this information. So many libraries have, or repositories, you can see this stuff, but you can't change it once it's, you know, on their website. But some of them you can. So you don't want anybody going in and fiddling with your interview. So, but you also want the person to know that this is going to be out there, because everything now is out there. So, and that's kind of scary, but that's the world we live in. For the most part, oral histories are used for educational and research purposes. If you have a commercial purpose in mind, that has to be made clear to the person. Oral histories are owned by both the narrator and the interviewer. So you both have equal ownership. This release form releases their copyright to you, which is what most repositories will want to have happen, because they don't want to be checking with the person or their estate every time that it's used. Now I've seen other release forms where the person will state that you can quote up to 10 lines, or, you know, then you have to talk with somebody on the staff. So you want to build in those protections as much as you can. Again, that's a good reason for the repository working with you, so that they're aware and you're aware of any limitations that they might want to put, or give you information, the latest information on why and how those things are happening. We used one release form for the 30 years I've been doing oral histories. This new release form I've just used in the last couple of years, and that has been because of the web presence. So, and you know, the information that you want to put out there. The person should also have the opportunity to restrict materials, or restrict part of it, or restrict the whole thing. I would, if you're going to do an interview with somebody and they want to restrict the whole thing, it's better not even to do it, because it just makes a lot of work for you that you're never going to be able to use. So I always put this on here. Another restriction might be that they want to give you the interview, but they don't really want to release the interview for a set number of years, and that's okay. But you have to get a date for release. You can't say, well, 25 years after the person dies, because who's going to be there tracking that? And I can tell you that libraries absolutely hate that. I've been involved in 2 cases where we had to go back and track the individual. We couldn't find errors. We couldn't, their legal company, the person who had prepared their legal papers was no longer in business. Their records had been destroyed. And so you want to get as firm a commitment as possible. But again, if they want to restrict it forever, it's better just to not even do that and say, well, this isn't going to fit into our project right now. But informed consent is one of the ethical questions that we have in the oral history world, and what the release form should be able to accomplish. Working now with Native communities, there are, I think, many issues that are around Native communities, which I think are really key. And my hope would be that communities would want to keep that information in their communities and work out some way of doing that, so that you have some material that might be available generally, but that you also have a space for community material to be available that is only for the community. And that takes some negotiation and knowing how to do those kinds of release forms, and working with an archivist or a librarian oral historian who can help you to develop that. Because it may not even call for a release form if you're working in a Native community and you're saving material for your community only. So there are just different ways of dealing with it, and you just, I think, need to just protect yourself legally as much as possible, and to protect the integrity of the oral history and also of the interviewer. That is key. The interviewer is the key person in all of this, and respectfulness toward what they've given you is a priority.